Story 1. The Lantern Keeper. Camping in the Pacific Northwest had always been a tradition for my friends and me. We loved the thick forests, the smell of pine in the air, and the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. That year, we chose a remote spot in Olympic National Park, miles from the nearest marked trail. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. The first night was peaceful. We pitched our tents in a small clearing, cooked dinner over the fire, and shared stories under the stars. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The second night things changed. It started with a faint light flickering through the trees. At first, we thought it might be another group of campers, though we hadn't seen anyone else on our way in. But as we watched, the light didn't behave like a normal flashlight or lantern. It moved erratically, darting between the trees as if whoever was holding it couldn't decide where to go. "Maybe it's a park ranger," my friend Sam suggested, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Rangers wouldn't be out here this late," I replied. We decided to ignore it, convincing ourselves it was harmless. But the light didn't go away. It lingered at the edge of our campsite, just far enough away that we couldn't make out who, or what, was holding it. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching the dry leaves. I froze, holding my breath. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate, before stopping right outside the entrance. My heart pounded as I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest. The next morning, I told the others what had happened. To my surprise, they'd experienced similar things. Sam had heard faint humming, like someone was singing a lullaby just outside his tent. Jess swore she saw a shadow move past her tent, even though we were all supposed to be asleep. We agreed to pack up and leave, but as we started to dismantle our camp, we found something chilling. A lantern, old and rusted, was hanging from a low branch near the edge of the clearing. None of us had brought it. The glass was cracked, and the metal was so worn it looked like it had been sitting there for decades. The forest felt oppressive as we hiked out, the trees seeming to close in around us. Every so often we'd hear a twig snap or a faint rustle, but when we turned to look, there was nothing there. The light followed us, always at a distance, flickering like a firefly that refused to be shaken. As the sun began to set, we realized we were lost. The trail we'd marked on our way in had vanished, and the forest was unfamiliar. Panic set in as darkness fell and the light grew closer. It no longer flickered, it burned steadily as if guiding us deeper into the woods. Finally, we stumbled upon an old cabin, its roof sagging and its windows boarded up. Desperation overrode caution, and we decided to take shelter for the night. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew. The only furniture was a rotting wooden table and a single chair. As we settled in, the lantern light appeared again, this time right outside the window. It stayed there, unmoving as if waiting for us to come out. "Who's there?" Jess shouted, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of footsteps approaching the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, just like the ones I'd heard the night before. Then came the humming, a low, haunting tune that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, the door creaked open, though no one was standing there. The light from the lantern flooded the room, casting long shadows across the walls. In the doorway stood a figure, a man dressed in old, tattered clothes, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. He held the lantern in one hand and a rusted axe in the other. We froze, too terrified to move. The man stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. He placed the lantern on the table, its flame flickering but never going out. Then, without a word, he turned and left, closing the door behind him. We didn't sleep that night. The lantern stayed on the table, its light casting eerie patterns on the walls. The humming continued, faint but constant, as if it was coming from the woods, or from the lantern itself. At first light, we bolted from the cabin, leaving our gear behind. The forest seemed to twist and shift around us, but we kept moving, driven by sheer terror. Hours later, we stumbled onto a dirt road and flagged down a passing truck. The driver, an older man, listened as we babbled about the lantern and the man in the cabin. "You must have gone into Lantern Keeper's territory," he said grimly. "Legend says he was a logger who went mad after losing his family in a fire. He wanders the woods looking for people to join him." We didn't say another word on the ride back to town. To this day, I can't hear the sound of a lantern's flame without feeling a cold knot of fear in my stomach. Whatever we encountered in those woods, it wasn't human, and it wasn't meant to be found. Story 2. The Screaming Ridge. It was my cousin Matt's idea to camp at Screaming Ridge. The name alone should have been enough to turn me off, but he swore it was just a local legend, a ghost story meant to scare kids from wandering too far into the woods. We were young and eager for an adventure, so we loaded our gear and drove out to the isolated hiking trail that led to the ridge. The trail was rough, winding through dense forest and steep inclines. By the time we reached the top, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the rocky outcrop. The view was breathtaking, a vast expanse of trees stretching into the horizon, bathed in the golden light of dusk. We pitched our tents in the center of the ridge and started a small fire, feeling triumphant. As the night wore on, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. It sounded almost like a voice, distant and mournful. Matt laughed it off, calling it the Screaming Ridge soundtrack, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. Around midnight, the first scream tore through the air. It was sharp and guttural, echoing off the rocks and freezing us in place. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like an animal either. It was something else entirely. We stared at each other, trying to laugh it off, but the fear in Matt's eyes mirrored my own. "Probably just a coyote," he said, though his voice wavered. The second scream came from closer. It was longer, almost like it was building toward something. Then the forest fell silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no insects. Just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. "We should go," I whispered, but Matt shook his head. "We'll be fine. It's just the wind." The next scream came from directly behind us. We spun around, flashlights in hand, but there was nothing there, just the dark trees and the faint outline of our tents. Then we saw the shadows. They weren't shaped like animals or even people. They were tall, misshapen figures, shifting unnaturally at the edge of the firelight. I wanted to run, but Matt insisted we stay put. He grabbed a stick from the fire and waved it toward the shadows, shouting, "Get out of here." The shadows didn't move. Instead, they seemed to grow taller, stretching like smoke against the night sky. Then one by one they began to crawl. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as they closed the distance between us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Matt's arm and pulling him toward the trail. We didn't bother packing our gear, we just ran, the screams following us down the ridge. They were deafening now, blending into a cacophony of voices. Some were high-pitched, others guttural, all of them filled with rage. We stumbled through the forest, barely able to see the trail in the dark. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder and see the shadows trailing us, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. After what felt like hours, we burst onto the main road and collapsed, gasping for breath. The screams had stopped, but the silence was just as terrifying. We flagged down a passing car, and the driver took us back to town without asking any questions. Later we found out the truth about Screaming Ridge. Decades ago, a group of loggers had camped there during the winter. One by one they disappeared, their bodies never found. Locals claimed the ridge was cursed, that the spirits of the lost loggers roamed the forest, screaming for the lives they'd been denied. Matt and I never went camping again. Even now, years later, I can't hear a scream without remembering that night, the shadows, the voices, and the feeling that we were never meant to leave. Story 3. The Watcher in the Clearing. A few summers ago, I joined a group of friends for a camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. The spot we picked was deep in the forest, far from any marked trails or campsites. It was a perfect clearing surrounded by towering oaks and pines, with a small stream nearby for fresh water. It felt like we had the entire wilderness to ourselves. The first day went smoothly. We hiked, fished, and set up camp without a hitch. As the sun set, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and owls. We built a roaring fire and shared stories late into the night. But as we were winding down, something changed. The forest went silent. At first we thought nothing of it. Maybe the fire was too bright or our laughter had scared the animals away. But the silence wasn't natural. It felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The air seemed thicker and a strange unease settled over us. "I feel like we're being watched," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. We all laughed nervously, but deep down I felt it too, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like unseen eyes were following our every move. Eventually we crawled into our tents and tried to sleep. I lay there, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, listening to the oppressive silence. Then around midnight I heard it, a faint rustling coming from the edge of the clearing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer. But the rustling grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside my tent. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to any animal. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. At first I saw nothing. But then my beam caught something at the edge of the trees, a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that seemed to stretch out of proportion. Its face was pale and featureless, with hollow black eyes that stared directly at me. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if it was draining the air from my lungs. I scrambled backward, knocking over my lantern in the process. The noise woke the others, and soon their flashlights were darting around the clearing. The figure was gone, but the forest still felt wrong, as if the shadows were thicker and the trees closer than before. The rest of the night was a blur. We huddled together around the fire, too scared to sleep, jumping at every sound. The figure didn't return, but the sense of being watched never left. The next morning we decided to pack up and leave. As we dismantled our tents, Sarah let out a sharp gasp. We followed her gaze to the ground near the edge of the clearing. There, pressed into the soft earth, were enormous footprints, long and narrow, with claw-like impressions at the tips of the toes. They circled our campsite, coming dangerously close to our tents. We hiked out in tense silence, constantly looking over our shoulders. When we reached the parking lot, an older man sitting in his truck waved us over. "Y'all were camping deep in there, huh?" he asked, a strange look in his eyes. We nodded and he shook his head. That forest has a history. People go missing out there, and the ones who come back, well, they don't come back, right?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you see it, don't let it follow you. Whatever you do, don't look back." We didn't ask him to explain. We just got in our cars and drove, the weight of his words settling heavily over us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw in that clearing. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I feel that same prickling sensation at the back of my neck. And I wonder if it ever really left. Story 4. The Vanishing Trail. 3 years ago, my boyfriend Ryan and I decided to spend a long weekend camping in a remote part of the Colorado Rockies. We've been camping plenty of times before, but this trip felt different, more isolated. The trail we chose was unmarked, recommended by a park ranger who mentioned it was pristine and rarely traveled. That sounded perfect to us. The first day was uneventful. We hiked deep into the wilderness, marveling at the towering peaks and thick pines around us. By late afternoon, we found a small clearing by a stream and set up camp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we cooked dinner and watched the stars emerge, feeling completely alone in the world. But that night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought Ryan was talking in his sleep, but when I rolled over, I saw he was still out cold. The whispers continued, faint and indecipherable, coming from somewhere outside the tent. I sat up, straining to hear. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping, as if a group of people were having a quiet conversation just out of earshot. I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The forest was bathed in moonlight, and the clearing was empty. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to be coming from the trees, growing louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. I shook Ryan awake, my voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up and listened. At first he shook his head, but then his expression changed. "Yeah, what is that?" We both stared at the tree line, frozen. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Neither of us slept much after that. The next morning we debated whether to leave, but Ryan convinced me to stay. It was probably just the wind, he said, though he didn't sound convinced. We spent the day hiking further into the forest, hoping to shake off the unease from the night before. That afternoon we found something odd, a narrow trail branching off from the main one. It was overgrown and barely visible, as if no one had used it in years. Curiosity got the better of us and we decided to follow it. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and darker around us. After about an hour, we stumbled upon a small cabin. It looked ancient, its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. "Let's check it out," Ryan said, already heading for the door. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I followed him inside. The cabin was empty, save for a single wooden chair in the center of the room. The air inside was cold, far colder than it should have been. As I stepped closer to the chair, I noticed something carved into the floorboards around it. Symbols, crude and jagged, like something scratched into the wood with a knife. They didn't look like any language I recognized. "This is creepy," I whispered, and Ryan nodded. "Let's go." We left the cabin and started back down the trail. But after a few minutes, something felt off. The trail wasn't the same. The trees seemed closer, the path narrower, as if the forest itself was changing around us. We kept walking, but the trail didn't lead back to the clearing. It just went on and on. By now, the sun was setting and panic began to set in. We'd only walked for an hour, yet it felt like we were miles from where we'd started. Then we heard it, the whispers. Faint at first, but growing louder, coming from every direction. My hands started shaking as I grabbed Ryan's arm. "What's going on?" He didn't answer. He was staring ahead, his face pale. I followed his gaze and saw them, figures standing in the trees. They were human-shaped but wrong, too tall, too thin, their limbs bent at unnatural angles. Their faces were featureless, just smooth, pale ovals that reflected the dying light. "Run," Ryan said, his voice barely audible. We took off, crashing through the underbrush, the trail forgotten. The whispers turned into a cacophony, louder and louder, until it felt like they were inside my head. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling behind us. Eventually we burst into another clearing. To our shock, it was our original campsite. Our tent and gear were still there, untouched. We grabbed everything and ran, following the main trail back to the parking lot without stopping. It was nearly midnight when we reached the car. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Neither of us could explain what had happened, and we didn't want to try. A week later, I decided to research the area. What I found made my blood run cold. According to local lore, the cabin was part of a logging camp abandoned in the early 1900s. The loggers reportedly went missing, and search parties found only their tools and clothing, neatly arranged outside the cabin. Some said the forest had taken them, and others claimed it was something older, something that didn't want people in its domain. Ryan and I haven't been camping since. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear faint whispers, like an echo of that trail. And I wonder if we really left that forest, or if a part of us is still there. Story 5, The Campfire Pact. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me, my brother David, and his girlfriend Mia. We'd found a remote campsite online, deep in the Ozarks, and decided it was the perfect place to disconnect and unwind. The drive was long and winding with no cell service for miles. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was already setting. The site was beautiful, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a crystal-clear lake nearby. We pitched our tents, built a fire, and settled in for the night. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, serene even. Around midnight, we decided to tell scary stories. It felt cliché, but the atmosphere was perfect. David started with a classic urban legend, and Mia followed with a ghost story she swore had happened to a friend of hers. Then it was my turn. "I've got a real one," I said, leaning closer to the fire. "Have you ever heard of the Campfire Pact?" David and Mia shook their heads, so I continued. "It's this old legend about campers who go too deep into the woods. They're visited by something. Some say a spirit, others say it's a demon. It shows up at their campfire and offers them a choice: make a pact or be taken." "Taken where?" Mia asked, her voice hushed. "No one knows," I said. "The story goes that if you make the pact, you have to promise to never tell anyone about what happened. If you break the promise, it'll come back for you." David snorted. "That's ridiculous. Where'd you hear that?" I shrugged. "Just something I read online." We laughed it off and turned in for the night. But as I lay in my tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I told myself it was just the story getting to me and eventually drifted off. I woke up to the sound of crackling flames. Confused, I checked my watch. 3:14 a.m. The fire should have been out hours ago. Crawling out of my tent, I froze. There was someone sitting at our campfire. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark, tattered clothing. Its face was hidden by the shadows, but its presence was suffocating. Mia and David were already awake, standing on the edge of the clearing, their faces pale. "Who are you?" David called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it turned its head slowly toward me as if acknowledging my presence. Then it spoke, its voice low and gravelly, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "You summoned me? What the hell are you talking about?" I stammered. The figure tilted its head. "You told the story. You invoked the pact." My blood ran cold. It couldn't be real. It was just a stupid campfire story. But here it was, sitting by our fire, speaking as if it had been waiting for this moment. "I don't want to play games," David said, stepping forward. "You need to leave." The figure didn't move. "The choice is yours," it said. "Make the pact or I'll take one of you." Mia started crying and David grabbed my arm. "We're leaving," he said. "Now." As we turned to pack up our gear, the figure stood, towering over us. Its shadow stretched across the clearing, impossibly long and dark. "You can't run," it said. "The woods are mine. You won't make it out alive." Panic set in as we scrambled to grab our things. But every time we tried to step away from the fire, the figure appeared in front of us, no matter which direction we went. It was as if the forest itself was keeping us trapped. "You must decide," it said. "The pact or the price." I didn't know what else to do. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend what was happening. Finally, I blurted out, "Fine. I'll do it. Just let us go." The figure stepped closer, its face still obscured. "Swear it," it said. "Swear to keep this night a secret. Tell no one or I'll return." "I swear," I said, my voice trembling. "I swear." The figure seemed to shrink, its shadow receding into the darkness. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The fire went out, plunging us into darkness. We didn't speak as we packed up and left. The hike back to the car was a blur and none of us looked back. By the time we reached the parking lot, the sun was rising, but the terror of that night hadn't faded. We made a pact of our own, to never talk about what happened even to each other. But the story didn't end there. A week later, David called me in a panic. "It's back," he said. "It's at my apartment." I didn't want to believe him, but then Mia called the next day, sobbing about seeing the figure in her bedroom. I told myself it was just their imagination, that we were all just paranoid after what had happened. But then, 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of crackling flames. The figure was sitting at the foot of my bed. "You broke the pact," it said, its voice like gravel. "Now you're mine." I've been running ever since, trying to stay ahead of it. But no matter where I go, I see the fire and I hear its voice. If you're reading this, consider this a warning. Never tell the story of the campfire pact. And if you do, don't break the promise.